This is for Liberty University. I'm studying to receive a Bachelor's of Science degree in history. I hope to use that to further the kingdom of God. Over today we have with us, this is Dorothy Dangerfield. Now, Aunt Dorothy, do you use the name Ham as a middle name, or do you use May as a middle name?
H. Dangerfield is what I use.
Okay, so this is my great aunt, which means I'm your great nephew.
That's right. Well,
So this is my great aunt, Dorothy Dangerfield. She lives in Charleston, South Carolina, actually in Jamestown, or James Island is correct. James Island, part of Charleston, South Carolina. And she is the oldest member of our family. She was born, as she said earlier, she was born in 1924. And so we're going to take just about 15 or 20 minutes, if that's all right, and interview her. And so, Aunt Dorothy, to give you the background of where I am on your history, Karen has already given me a good bit of your historical background. In other words, your birth. She's told me that your mother had passed away. She's told me some things about your children, where they went to school.
I even know my mother now. She passed away when I was very young.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. And so the first question I was going to ask you on my list, I do understand that you were very young and that you probably didn't really remember her. But so you lived with relatives and with your daddy for all of your life. And you know, looking at it from a historical context, the life for women in our country particularly has changed dramatically over the course of your lifetime. And so I was wondering if you had some views on how difficult it was to be raised during that time period versus maybe modern time or today's time.
In my position, it was very difficult because I had, there was 7 or 8 of us, I don't remember how many now, but I was the youngest, and I was always, and my mother had died, and my dad sort of gave up on everything. You know, he lost his wife, and he just couldn't do anything for us much anymore except to come see us occasionally.
Mm-hmm.
But I stayed with a brother. His name was Roy. Maybe Leroy, I don't think. Ham. And when his wife would get tired of me, then they'd send me to live with another brother till they got tired of me, and then they'd send me to a sister. So I went from pillar to post. I really did.
That's right.
And I always hated to leave any home I was in because I felt this is my home now. But when I finally got where I could get a job of my own, I did at Woolworth Dime Store downtown in Charleston. And I decided now I'm on my own, I'm paying my own bills.
That's right.
And I can live like I want to. And I did, and I met a very fine person, my husband, Henry Dangerfield. And he lived in Monk's Corner, and we got married, had 4 children, and lived happy ever after until he died from a spider bite. We were visiting in Florida.
No, he didn't die of a spider bite.
He did.
He didn't. He lived to 1989. The
She
spider bite.
corrected me.
The spider bite happened much earlier.
Okay, she said the
And
spider
he
bite
died,
didn't cause his death, but
but he was sick from that. Very
he was
sick.
sick from it.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually did. But anyway, we had 4 children, and 3 living children. One of them has passed away.
Yes, ma'am.
And, any other questions?
Yes, ma'am. I do.
From that aspect of you, the way children are done with now is they put them in foster care. So at the time when you were being moved from place to place, either children like that would have been placed in an orphanage probably, or go to relatives? And you were
I went
placed-
to relatives.
You went to
You
relatives.
went to relatives, that's correct.
She'd
That's
come to
right.
our house every
And
That's
year.
they'd
right.
keep me for a while, and then
Spend
I'd go
the
to
summer
another
with us.
relative.
Mhm.
And always, the, wife of the brother,
And that's her, that right there talking, sounds just like her.
intrusion in her family, and I understand that.
Well, that, you know, that's a familiar, story for many for many people. And it's like Karen said, the potential for being put in an orphanage, it was either that option, either orphanage or living with family members. So I'm sure it was very difficult for you. I mean, I'm sure it made you, appreciate your own family very much.
Oh, I'm
And home.
very glad to have my own home and a good husband and a wonderful family.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Well, my next question is, you just shared it, and Karen had shared it with me earlier, that you'd worked for Woolworth, first as a cashier and then later as bookkeeper. And so this question is kind of toward what the civil rights movement was like during your time in your young days. There was a sit-in a Woolworth in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1960 where some young black people went in there and sat down at the counter, and then they were told they wouldn't be served, and so they refused to leave, and they called it the Woolworth sit-in. And I don't know if you were still working with Woolworths at that time in 1960, or had you would have already been home. I guess if Hank is, not Hank, if Doug is my age, then he would have been 5 years old at that point, because he and I are within a few months of each other in age. And so I guess the question I was asking is, if you're not familiar with the sit-in, at least give me some of your thoughts on the civil rights during that time period of when Doug would have been 5 years old.
The lunch counter was always white at that time.
The lunch counter, right, the lunch counter, blacks were not allowed to sit at the lunch counter. And,
They had their own beach.
yeah, and they had their own beach, beach for them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And they were not allowed to the white beach. Folly,
Or even water fountains.
yeah, and,
I know you're a Christian woman, but I'm gonna ask you something that's very difficult, maybe, but to the point personally for you, how did you feel? Because we've all evolved in racial things over the years. How did you feel at that time toward black people? Did you feel like that we were treating them in a bad way, or did you feel like that was the norm and that was just part of life, or how did you feel about it?
well, I don't remember a lot about that, but I don't remember ever being, refusing to serve any blacks in the store. A lot of people would not, but I would. And I thought they had as much right to sit at the counter and have lunch as anybody else. Those were my thoughts, but I couldn't do a thing about them.
Sure. Well, it's good that, my mother, she always relates that they were raised, where they were raised in North Carolina, they were raised by a black family and never taught any prejudice or any difference because of color. And so that was interesting. I just wanted to hear your take on that, because, many people just said, well, that's the norm, and the things we grew up with. I mean, I'm not as old as y'all are, but I can remember when the theater was segregated still in our town, and I never even gave it a thought. I didn't think about it being wrong. I just thought that's the way it was. I thought they chose not to sit with us.
That's the way I felt when they come in
Yeah.
to the counter and didn't sit down. The white people could sit down.
Mm-hmm.
But they could be served over the counter, but, they'd have to take it away.
Had to take it somewhere. That's right. Okay. Well, now,
I really thought that was wrong. I thought they had a right.
change gears now. The next question basically is, our family has a strong connection to service to country. I know that your family's been very involved with the military. I know that Uncle Henry served in the Navy, and I know both of your sons have worked with the military in I think a civilian capacity is what Karen told me. But I understand that you had some brothers that were in maybe World War II.
Yeah, I had, Claude Ham was my brother,
Mm-hmm.
and he served overseas, and
Baxter,
and Baxter, what's my other brother name? Those were the two brothers that were in service,
I see.
Claude Ham and Baxter.
Claude Ham and Baxter Ham. And both of them served in the military
They did,
in World War II.
World War II.
I'm going to search them this next week as part of an assignment. I'm going to search them on Ancestry.com, and I've already saw their names there, and so I'm going to follow their family tree, and I may very well be able to call y'all and tell y'all exactly what service branch they were in before it's over with. I was able to find my granddaddy Young and find the infantry unit that he was in France during World War I. So I may very be able to find Baxter and Claude. And I actually met Uncle Baxter. He actually came to our house one time when I was very small, maybe 10 or 12 years old. So I do remember him. I may have met Uncle Claude, maybe, but I'm not sure if I did or not. But I know I did meet Baxter. Mm-hmm.
something tells me, I think you've told me in the past they were in the Army, but I could be wrong.
Okay. Well, I'll check that out. Now, Uncle Henry, did he serve during wartime or was he during peacetime service?
I'm trying to remember that.
He served in the Navy as a cook, and he was stationed in St. Augustine, Florida.
Yeah,
Really? That's one.
in the Navy as a cook, that's
I
right.
see. And so he would have served. Y'all would have probably got married maybe early 1950s.
Yeah, around that time.
So he would probably have served before the Korean conflict, but after the Second World War. Does that sound right?
That's right.
Well,
Yeah.
his twin brother, Eddie Dangerfield, went to the Army, and Henry went into the Navy
Mm-hmm.
about the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah, you did have.
they were twins.
You lived in Monk's Corner.
Monk's Corner, same place that Charlie lives now. Okay.
That's where they grew up.
That's right. Cool. That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Now you were born in you lived in Mullins, South Carolina. Is that correct?
I lived there, but I was born in Pamplico.
Okay.
At least that's what they told me.
I got you. Okay.
Or was it Prosperity?
No, Pamplico,
Okay.
near Florence.
Let me ask you this. Going on to the next question. You were born in 1924, so if I'm doing the math right, you would have been about 17 years old when the Pearl Harbor attack
Right.
occurred. Tell me your remembrance or your recollection of that.
My recollection of that is I was in high school, and our teacher, gentleman, man teacher, told us he was going to have to leave, and we all got upset, but he was ready to go. He said, I have to sign up. And he just couldn't even take another day. He had to get in there.
So he went directly and signed
He
up
went
for service.
directly from our high school, teaching high school, to join the service.
That's
There was a
amazing.
big, strong patriotic movement to join in the men that could do it.
How were y'all really, I mean, it really upset y'all? I mean, were y'all really scared that they were going to attack the mainland of the United States? Were y'all fearful of that? Was there talk of that?
I don't remember any talk of that. We were all disappointed because he was going to leave us, but he explained to us that was his duty,
Mhm.
and that he had to do that.
That's wonderful. That's a good story to hear. Now, I know you were young, and this is backing up a little bit because I just talked about Pearl Harbor, but the Great Depression occurred, in the 1930s. How did the Great Depression affect y'all's life?
Well, we just had to cut back on everything.
things were rationed?
Rationing was long that time too, I believe.
Sugar.
And it's hard to get sugar.
Loaves.
I worked at a dime store, and it was hard for us to get the merchandise to sell to the public.
Mm.
And I remember one day a lady came in and she wanted something that I explained to her that we simply did not have and could not get. And she got mad and threw something at me.
Oh my
And I
goodness.
went back to her. Not that. I said, I didn't cause this thing. I said,
That's right.
That's right.
Loaves, sugar,
those were,
gasoline.
Gasoline was rationed too during that time, wasn't it?
stockings people could get readily before they hardly could get anymore.
My goodness. So many people without jobs. I remember Granddaddy telling me of receiving very little cash money during that time. They worked a lot for, I guess you'd call it the barter system. They worked for eggs or for maybe grits or things like that.
Yeah.
That's right.
That's
Right.
true.
Absolutely. Okay. I found your father and your mother on Ancestry.com, and your father's father and your father's mother, they were both born in the middle 1800s. Did you meet either one of them?
I did not know my grandparents at all.
Okay. I was his name was Peter Andrew Ham.
Yeah, that was my uncle.
Okay. His daddy's name was also Peter Andrew Ham. In other words, your uncle, your daddy's brother, he was named after his daddy. Is that right? And then your mother's name was, your grandmother's name would have been Virginia
Yes.
on his side, and her last name was Muma.
Virginia Muma Ham.
That's right. That was a kind of an unusual name. I wasn't sure if you knew maybe
She was a great lady though.
you knew her then.
Oh yes.
Okay. Now she, do you know where they were descended from? Do you know where they came from, as far as Europe? Do you know what part of the? Because they were both born in like mid 1800s, I guess. Actually, they died in the early. I think she died maybe like when you were 9, like 1935 or something like that.
Mom's told us in the past that her great-grandparents or grandparents came from Holland. They were Dutch.
Okay.
So I don't know.
We're
But,
Dutch.
Very interesting. That's very interesting. So we have Dutch blood. Okay, very good. Yes. So that's interesting. All right, I realize the next question. I realize that education is something you have valued all your life, and your children all have graduated and are college graduates, and a lot of that been due to your encouragement and your perseverance pushing them. And of course, their perseverance too. It takes all of it. But
They all went to Clemson.
tell me about going to college or going to further education for a woman when you were a teenager. What would it have been like then? How is it different than now?
Well, it was almost impossible. If you finished high school, that was the best I was allowed to do.
That's right.
And you had enough of discouraging you.
Then you went to work. I went to work in a dime store.
They expected women to go to work or either get married, didn't they, and have children. That's right.
Plus, you had to overcome an uncle wanting you just to not finish high school.
Well, that was a brother.
Right. My
One of my
brother.
brothers, I lived with one of the brothers, and
He wanted you just to
he
get a job.
wanted me to quit school and go to work. And I wouldn't do it, and I left his home.
Right after you graduated.
Yeah.
Well, and that's the strength of your character. That's a testimony and strength of your character. And I'm very thankful that you do think so much of education, and your children are very intelligent. Just talking to Karen, she's a very intelligent person. I love to listen to her. She's so articulate, and it's just a pleasure to hear the things she said.
I had 3 sons, and they all graduated from Clemson. Karen,
Well, Mike graduated from the
from
College
the
of
College
Charleston.
of Charleston.
That's right.
He didn't want to leave home.
He was a homesick.
He was a homebody, and we all have one of those.
He
My
had
son.
more him in him than anybody. He had the dark black hair.
That's
He
right.
looked just like Mom.
Yeah,
That's
he
right.
did.
That's
He
right.
used to come to the door and say, "Mom, I got hair just like you."
That's wonderful. That's wonderful.
Those memories are wonderful.
And he was
Yes,
the
ma'am.
musical one, playing the piano and the harmonica
And the guitar.
and
Very
the
good.
guitar.
That's wonderful.
He had a little band, and they get together somewhere in the neighborhood and play the music.
And Mom would sell tickets.
Yeah,
Now he was fairly young. He died at what, 28 years of age?
yes, that matter.
And that's a,
He was in a fatal accident coming home from work
yes ma'am,
on Johns Island.
yes ma'am. I lost my brother Jeff. He was 23 in a logging accident. And so, I know that was a very difficult thing for you.
Hardest thing that
For-
ever happened.
Yes, ma'am. I'm sure for my mother, losing Jeff at 23, that was probably the hardest thing she's ever faced in her life. And
And then I had a brother that, Roy, and a tree fell on him. He was doing work in the, logging, and, while he was doing that, a tree fell and killed him.
now,
And that's-
if I understand right on that story, was he not working with my granddaddy McNeil?
Yes, probably.
They were together when that accident occurred.
And he got hurt too, but not bad, wasn't
Right. That's right. I always understood that they took him to the hospital, and he did not want to be there, so he climbed out the window and just left. Never did go back and pay him or anything.
That's right.
That's pretty.
They were together when that happened.
That's right. Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Yeah, we're big on climbing out of the windows.
That's wonderful. All right. Let's see. Let me go to the next one. You are the oldest living relative that I know of in my family. In other words, tracing my family tree back through my grandmother. And I decided, I said, well, when I started looking at who I was going to trace, I said, well, I'm going to go through my mother, because I can go from my mother to my grandmother, and then I can go back to her grandmother very quickly. So I said, and then that gets me to Aunt Dot. And so and I wrote in the question, I said, if you were going to share something with my grandchildren, but let me just rephrase that and say, if you were going to share that with any of our family, be it your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren, or any of mine, I have 8 grandchildren now, so what is something, if you had something you'd like to say to them, what would it be?
Children,
To the children, to your grandchildren, my grandchildren, to anyone in our family, as the matriarch of our family.
I would tell them to be close to the family always,
Believe in God.
and believe in God, and give it everything they got
And get an education.
to education's important in my life for my children, and I would hope he would get the education.
That's wonderful. That's a wonderful word, and you're a wonderful testament to our family. I just got 2 more questions, and I know y'all came from church, so you probably have not even had lunch yet. And so let me ask you this. We grew up in a farming community. I mean, my family farmed. My daddy was a farmer. Granddaddy McNeil, he was a farmer. And I know that from what grandmama's told me, y'all all farmed some. And Karen's relayed that to me also. What are some of the commodities? Did you ever help produce tobacco? Did y'all do that?
My goodness, yes. I've cropped it, and go to the field and crop the good leaves off.
That's right.
I couldn't string it, but I could hand it to the person that could string it on the pole, and they stuck it up in a barn and cured it, and then somebody'd sleep at the barn for several nights till it was ready to come out, and then they'd take it out and take it to the market and sell it.
You speak the language we spoke. In other words, if you go a little farther north of y'all in North Carolina, they call it priming tobacco. We call it cropping, just what you said, cropping, and we called it stringing. They had a different term. I don't remember now what they called it in North Carolina. It was a little different. But so you grew up in the same area with the same language of tobacco that I grew up with, because we grew tobacco till I was 22, and so I was very familiar with the terms you said. Now let me ask this: how about cotton? Did you have anything ever to do? Cotton was the king in the South at one time.
I thought that was the most boring job I ever could possibly do, was to pick cotton. It was so, cotton's nothing. You put it in there and you can work out there half a day and you've got a little bit of cotton.
And to wreck your hands.
That's,
I did it.
that's wonderful. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this. Final question. What would you consider the most historical event, either invention, cultural change, whatever, in your lifetime? What would you consider the most impactful event?
Sent somebody to the moon, didn't we?
Yes, ma'am. In 1969, we surely did.
And,
What about,
let me see what else.
was the President Kennedy being shot a big one?
Yeah.
That's you saying that. My grandmother, Ernestine, she loved John F. Kennedy, and she always taught me things about him. And I have the book on the shelf, Profiles in Courage, that he had written. That she gave me that book when I was just a kid, and I have a plaque, and I still have it to this day. Ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. And that's good. That's amazing to hear you say that same thing about John F. Kennedy being a big
And Mom
impact.
will always say she always remembered that date and always knew what she was doing when that happened.
I was in school, I think. But now you said you mentioned the name Ernestine.
Right.
That was your sister.
I had a sister. My oldest sister was named Ernestine.
And that was my grandmother.
Yes.
Yes.
And she was married to
Clifford.
McNeil.
McNeil. Yes, ma'am. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yes, ma'am. That's correct. Yes, ma'am.
I lived with them. I lived with anybody that would have me. Because I was the last child, and everybody else had their own family, and so I would live with, I say, a sister for a while, and then she would say when that's somebody else's turn, and then so I was the take turn child.
That's right. That's right.
And one of the things that you need to know is Mom always told us that when she was growing up, nobody ever really asked her, what would you like to grow up and be? As far as education goes, because that really wasn't part of what they were doing. So even being asked, what do you want to be when you grow up? Their answer was always either be married or be working.
Mm-hmm.
And then, but her aunt, my mom's sister, Kathleen Ratliff, when she got moved to a different home when the father died, she actually became a nurse. She was a nurse and got her nursing degree as an RN, and then worked at the hospital right across the street from her home in Wadesboro, North Carolina, and at some point gave up nursing. But she was one person in the family of your siblings that actually got a nursing degree.
Yeah, and my
That's
brothers, of course, were in the war. Claude and Baxter, and I think they were the only two, the grown ones.
I understand. That's
You had-
wonderful.
How many brothers? You had how many brothers?
I had
and sisters?
three brothers. Roy, who was in that tree accident I told you about, but he survived. And Claude, and Baxter, and Clifton.
Oh,
Okay.
Clifton.
So
Right.
you had 4 brothers.
And 3 sisters. Essie, Ernestine,
Ernestine, Kathleen,
Mm-hmm.
Essie, and Ernestine.
Okay,
yeah,
very good. That's very good.
I know who that is.
I had an Aunt Essie, and I thought that was for sure on your side of the family.
Let me just say I thank you very much today for this interview, and I thank you for sharing your thoughts on some historical times, and we just love y'all very much.